Imagine standing inside a massive grain port just before sunrise. Towering silos stretch into the sky. Conveyor belts rumble to life. Cargo ships wait silently along the docks as millions of tons of wheat begin their journey across the world. Within weeks, that grain will become bread in crowded cities, noodles in distant markets, and animal feed on farms thousands of kilometers away. Most people never think about this system, but every single day, it quietly feeds billions. Now imagine something changes. Not the weather, not the harvest, a decision. What if, one morning, several of the world's largest food exporting nations suddenly stopped selling their crops to the global market? Not because of drought, not because of disaster, but because they chose to. In that moment, food would stop being just a commodity. It would become leverage. And in a world where entire countries depend on imported grain just to feed their populations, that single decision could reshape the balance of global power almost overnight. Because if food becomes a weapon, the battlefield wouldn't be fought with tanks or missiles. It would begin at the dinner table. You see, for most of human history, food was local. Villages depended on nearby farms. Cities survived on harvests grown within walking distance or transported by simple trade routes. If a region suffered a bad harvest, the crisis was usually contained to that area. But the modern world has transformed how food moves. Today, the global food supply works more like a vast international network than a collection of isolated farms. This system connects farmers, ports, cargo ships, storage facilities, and markets across nearly every continent. And for billions of people, that connection is essential. Many countries no longer produce enough food to sustain their entire population. Some face limited farmland, others struggle with water shortages, difficult climates, or rapidly expanding cities that replace agricultural land. To make up the difference, they rely heavily on imported crops. When the system runs smoothly, it allows food to move efficiently from places with abundant harvests to places where food is needed most. It is one of the largest and most important networks supporting modern civilization. But like any complex system, its strength depends on the stability of the connections that hold it together. Now, imagine the disruption begins. Several of the world's largest food exporting nations suddenly announced that they are suspending major grain exports, not because the harvest failed, not because of a natural disaster, but because controlling food supply suddenly serves a strategic purpose. At first, the change seems distant. The farms are still producing, the silos are still full, but something critical has stopped moving. Ships that normally carry grain across oceans remain in port. Within hours, global commodity markets react. Traders scramble to understand how much supply has just disappeared from international circulation. Prices begin climbing almost immediately. Countries that rely heavily on imported food notice the shift right away. Governments rush to secure emergency purchases before prices rise even further. The sudden demand creates pressure across the entire system. Importers compete for the same remaining shipments. Contracts are renegotiated. Some suppliers begin prioritizing certain buyers over others. The balance that once kept food flowing smoothly between nations begins to strain, and the effects spread quickly. A disruption in exports does not stay contained within a single country. It moves through shipping routes, trade agreements, and global markets, touching every place that depends on that supply. Within weeks, the ripple becomes impossible to ignore. The world's food network, which once moved quietly in the background of daily life, suddenly becomes the center of global attention. Because when a basic resource stops moving through a system this large, the consequences rarely stay small. As prices continue climbing, the problem begins moving beyond markets and trade negotiations. For millions of families around the world, food is already one of the largest daily expenses. Even small increases in staple prices can stretch household budgets to the limit. Now, those increases are happening rapidly. Bread becomes more expensive. Cooking oil rises in price. Animal feed costs surge, pushing up the price of meat, eggs, and dairy. What started as a disruption in grain exports slowly spreads across the entire food chain. Governments begin feeling the pressure. Leaders face a difficult choice: spend massive amounts of money importing limited supplies or risk shortages at home. Some countries attempt to secure emergency deals with producers that are still exporting. Others take a more defensive approach. To protect their own populations, they begin restricting their own food exports as well. But each new restriction tightens the global supply even further. The system that once balanced harvests between nations begins fragmenting. Instead of food flowing freely through international markets, countries start holding on to whatever they can produce. And the longer that pressure continues, the more unstable the situation becomes. Because once food becomes scarce, the consequences rarely remain economic. They become social, they become political, and sometimes they become explosive. But turning food into a weapon is far more complicated than simply stopping exports. Agriculture doesn't behave like oil or manufacturing manufactured goods. Crops grow on seasonal cycles. Farmers depend on predictable markets to sell their harvest. And food, unlike many other resources, cannot be stored forever without loss. If major exporters suddenly close their markets for too long, they begin facing problems of their own. Grain silos fill up faster than they can be emptied. Storage costs rise. Farmers who expected to sell their harvests abroad may struggle to find buyers at home. In some cases, prices within the producing countries could even fall, hurting the very farmers who grow the food. There is also another limitation. Many nations that export crops still rely on imports for other parts of their food system. Fertilizers, animal feed, machinery, and agricultural technology often come from different regions of the world. Restricting trade in one direction can trigger retaliation in another. The global food system is deeply interconnected. Trying to use food purely as a geopolitical tool risks creating consequences that no single country can fully control. And there is one more complication that makes the situation even more uncertain: weather. A single drought, flood, or failed harvest in a major producing region can suddenly shrink the global food supply even further. In a tense world where trade has already been restricted, a natural shock like that could push the system into a far more dangerous position, which means that once the food network begins to strain, predicting exactly how events unfold becomes nearly impossible. And uncertainty is where the next phase of the story begins. Because when uncertainty begins to threaten something as essential as food, societies rarely remain passive for long. Governments start looking for ways to reduce their dependence on fragile supply chains. Countries that once relied heavily on imported grain begin investing more aggressively in their own agriculture. New irrigation systems expand farmland in dry regions. Research institutions push for crops that can survive drought, heat, and unpredictable weather. Farmers adopt technologies that allow them to produce more food from smaller areas of land. Cities begin exploring new methods of growing food closer to where people live. At the same time, governments begin building larger strategic food reserves. Instead of relying entirely on global markets, countries start storing months of grain as insurance against sudden disruptions. The goal is simple: buy time if the system breaks. But adaptation doesn't happen overnight. Expanding agriculture takes years. Developing new crops takes time. Building resilient food systems requires long-term planning that many nations have postponed for decades. And while these efforts slowly reshape how food is produced and stored, the world is left confronting a difficult reality. Because the question is no longer whether food systems can change. The real question is whether they can change fast enough.